Welcome back, because this one gets heavy fast. We are talking identity loss, illness, and what happens when success stops protecting you. And honestly, the wild part is how all of it hits at once. The body breaks, the name changes, and the mind just starts spiraling. That is such a brutal combo. What got me first was the stage name thing, because that sounds like losing your skin. If your whole public self gets stripped away, where do you even stand? Suddenly, you're not famous, you're just a guy with paperwork. That's the most depressing version of a fresh start. But he kept coming back to this split between Steven and Dynamo. Like one version is the performer, and the other is the person who hurts. And when the performer cannot perform, the whole identity starts shaking. Which is terrifying because people think confidence is the whole job. It is not confidence, it is survival with applause on top. That is a horrible industry description, by the way. No, but seriously, the illness part is where the story turns into a nightmare. Blood, hospital drip, pain that medication could not touch. And then Crohn's, arthritis, new symptoms, new trials, new waiting. The part that annoyed me was the waiting around 3 months for a medication. If you already know it is not working in 2 weeks, why are you trapped there? Bodies are rude like that because they do not care about schedules. The body did not read the healthcare calendar. But then infliximab gave him a real window back into life. And that matters because it was not hopeless forever. It just kept getting interrupted, first by COVID and then by everything else. That is the part people miss when they romanticize resilience. Resilience is often just being interrupted repeatedly and not fully collapsing, which is not exactly the inspirational poster version. Then the mental side starts sounding like a pressure cooker. He is trying to keep a career alive while feeling useless inside his own body. That sentence alone is enough to ruin somebody. And he says he hated the mirror, hated what came back at him. That is the kind of detail that lands because it is so ordinary and so awful. Like, it's not dramatic in a movie way, it's just relentless. And the self-harm part makes it even darker, because numbness becomes the enemy. He was literally trying to feel something at that point. That is not a performance problem anymore. That is a full human emergency. I also thought the partner angle was huge, because that is where the story changes. She is grieving too, but she still becomes the person who gets help moving. That is real love, not the cinematic version. No violins, no rain, just calling the doctor and staying in the mess. And the way he described his wife seeing him like that was brutal, because shame is not just about the act. It is about being witnessed in it. Yeah, the universe really said, let's make this embarrassing too. Dark joke, but honestly, that is how people talk when they are in pain. What did you make of his thing about being the husband and not being able to be strong? Because that hits the masculinity nerve without him turning it into a speech. People love to say men should open up. Then the minute they do, everybody panics. He did not need advice in that moment, he needed someone to stay. And the wife did that, which is probably why he is still here. The legal dispute part is frustrating because it is so hard to discuss without the details. But even without the details, you can feel the consequence. No social media, no easy public identity, no clean way to keep working. And if your art depends on visibility, that is not a small thing. It is not just promotion, it is oxygen. Which is insane because most people think social media is the shallow part. For him, it sounds like it was also infrastructure. I kept thinking about the line where he says magic was the only thing he was good at. That is the dangerous sentence because purpose can become a trap. If the one thing that saves you also becomes the only thing that defines you, you are exposed. Then if it disappears, the floor falls out. I do think the loud music analogy was surprisingly useful. Not because it was fancy, but because it was painfully accurate. Too much noise in the head, no room left for creativity. That is writer's block, except the stakes are your whole life. And what really stings is that he was still trying to rebuild while being medically limited. So it is not one crisis, it is stacked crises. Illness, grief, legal stress, money stress, identity stress, all at once. That is not a bad week, that is a collapse sequence. You cannot even call that a bad patch with a straight face. What I respected was that he did not pretend the recovery is complete. He is still dealing with bad days, still on medication, still figuring it out. That honesty is the strongest thing, he said. Because people want redemption arcs, but real life is maintenance. Unsexy bureaucratic maintenance. Medicine, therapy, patience repeat forever. And somehow, underneath all of it, he still wants magic again. Not the old version, but a new way to do it. That felt hopeful without being cheesy. Because he is not saying, I am fixed. He is saying, I am trying to find a way back. And that is where we should probably leave this chapter. Next time, the rebuild gets even more interesting. We get into what it means to create again when the old self is gone. And whether reinvention is freedom or just another kind of pressure. We will see you in episode 3. Welcome back. This one is about the crash after the shine and the weird grief of losing your own name. Because once the magic slows down, the real question becomes who you are without the applause. And honestly, that part hit harder than the success story stuff. He is talking about a stage name like it was both armor and a trap. That is such a brutal sentence if you sit with it for 2 seconds. Because Dynamo was not just a brand, it was basically his survival language. Right. And then imagine being cut off from that while your body is falling apart. That is not a bad week, that is an identity earthquake. Business disputes are already annoying, but they become evil when your whole self is tied to them. People hear legal battle and think paperwork, but this sounded like existential vandalism. Exactly. Because if the work is the thing keeping you alive, losing access to it is devastating. And then the body stuff starts stacking on top like a worst-case domino run. Blood poisoning, Crohn's complications, arthritis, and trial after trial, that is relentless. The scary part is how ordinary he makes the breakdown sound. He is not narrating drama, he is describing erosion. And the thing with pain is people always underestimate how much it rewires your mind. Totally, because eventually you stop asking what is wrong and start asking what is the point. That is the sentence that really scared me. Same, because once purpose gets cut off, the mind does some very dark accounting. And he keeps coming back to magic like it is both his gift and his wound. Which is wild, because most people talk about a job like it is separate from them. For him, it is basically fused to the nervous system. If your hands stop working and your art is hand-based, life gets rude fast. That is the kind of understatement only a magician could make on camera. But the deeper thing is he was already carrying old damage long before the public collapse. Yeah, the childhood bullying and racism were not just background details, they were the foundation. And that matters because people love a comeback story while ignoring what built the scar tissue. He kept saying magic helped him survive the bullying, which is such an important clue. The art was not a hobby, it was a refuge. So when that refuge disappears, the old pain does not just leave politely. It comes back with receipts. Pain is so organized about it too, which is offensive. And then his grandmother passing feels like the last structural beam giving way. Because she was the one person who loved him before the world decided he mattered. That part ruined me a little, not going to lie. And she was also the realist in the room, telling him to have something to fall back on. Which is so painful because her caution was loving, not dismissive. Grandmothers always see the chaos before everyone else does. They are basically emotional weather forecasters. But losing that person while you are already spiraling is catastrophic. And I think what makes this interview hard is how unspectacular the breakdown was. Not cinematic, not dramatic, just a person getting crushed in private. Exactly, and the privacy makes it easier for everyone else to miss it. Even the part where he says he started hurting himself to feel something, that is chilling. Numbness can look calm from the outside, but it is not calm at all. It is just pain with the volume turned way down. And then the partner piece mattered so much here. Because she did not magically fix him, she just stayed and pushed him toward help. That is actually the underrated part of love in crisis. People think support means saying the perfect sentence, but often it is just not leaving. And not making the person feel like a monster for surviving badly. He sounded almost surprised that she loved him through the mess. Which is heartbreaking because he was clearly not used to unconditional support. Being loved properly can apparently still feel suspicious. That is depressing but also annoyingly true. What I keep coming back to is how he separates Steven from Dynamo. Because Steven is the human being with limits, and Dynamo is the impossible machine. And that split is the trap, because the machine eventually starts demanding performance. Then when the machine breaks, the person feels like a fraud. That is such a brutal psychological setup, especially for someone whose whole career is built on being the guy who can do the impossible. Right, because the public image becomes a prison if you cannot still meet it. Success can be another form of pressure, just with better lighting. Better lighting and way worse expectations. And there is something very human in him saying he wanted to disappear because he felt like the problem. That is not vanity, that is collapse. He even said if he were gone, other people might be happier, which is so darkly logical in that state. Depression is terrifying because it can feel like math. And the math is always lying. Yes, thank you, because it is somehow always convinced it is being rational. The other thing is, the interview does not let him hide behind inspiration language. Yeah, he is not selling resilience as a neat package. He is admitting that recovery is messy, ongoing, and sometimes just survival. That honesty is what makes it useful. And maybe also what makes it hard to hear. Because it refuses the fantasy that one breakthrough fixes everything. The human brain would love a coupon code for healing, but no. Dude, if only therapy had a checkout page and a discount code. Still, what lands for me is that he is already rebuilding by naming all of it. Even if magic comes back in a different form, he is making space for that possibility. That is enough for now. And honestly, that is where we should leave this part of the story. Because the next chapter is not about the fall anymore. It is about what happens when you try to build a self that can survive it. We will see you in episode 3. And that is where the rebuild really starts to get interesting. Welcome back, because this one is about the crash after the applause faded. He is talking about illness, grief, identity, and what happens when success stops protecting you. And the wild part is the biggest battle is not even the public one. It is the one between Steven and Dynamo, which sounds like a legal thriller and a trauma response. Bro, that is exactly it. Like the stage name is both armor and handcuffs. Because once your body starts failing, that identity can feel like a joke you cannot escape. And he is not saying that lightly. He is saying it from a place of total exhaustion. That part about losing the ability to do the thing he loves is brutal. It is not just career loss, it is meaning loss. Exactly. And for a performer, that is like the floor vanishing under you. What hit me was how physical the decline got before it became emotional. Food poisoning, bowel complications, arthritis, then months of trial and error. And the absurd thing is, the medicine itself becomes a part-time job. 8 hours on a drip every few weeks is not exactly the glamorous magician lifestyle. And then COVID comes in and knocks even that stability sideways. That is the part people forget, that recovery is never one clean win. It is just a chain of almosts and relapses and small mercies. And all of that is happening while the public still expects the impossible guy to be impossible. Right, because apparently magicians are supposed to outwit biology too. If he could do that, we would not be having this conversation. We would be watching him sell immortality. But the real pressure is that he believes his value lives inside performance. So when performance disappears, the whole self-image starts collapsing. That is the dangerous part, because then every setback starts sounding like a verdict. He literally says he felt like there was no point in existing without magic. That line is terrifying because it is not drama, it is despair. And he is saying it with this exhausted honesty that makes it hit harder. What do you do when the thing that saved you for years stops working? That is the question under everything here. And then grief shows up like it owns the place. His grandfather had already passed, then his Nana, who was basically his emotional base camp. Losing the person who rooted for you while doubting the dream is such a complicated grief. Because she loved him, but she was also scared for him. That is such a real family dynamic, by the way. Supportive, worried, and low-key waiting for you to get a sensible job. The universal relative strategy, believe in you while preparing for your failure. But in this case, the fear was not disrespect, it was protective love. And then the legal fight strips away even the public identity he built. Losing the name that channels the whole machine, that is not small. That is like being told your own biography is no longer yours. Exactly, and I think that is why the Steven versus Dynamo thing matters so much. Dynamo is not just a nickname, it is a container for belief. Steven is the person who has to wake up and survive the consequences. One of them is doing card tricks, the other one is filling out pain forms. That is cruelly accurate. And the problem is, if the performer stops, the private self gets exposed. Which is why social media disappears too, because posting starts feeling dishonest. He does not feel like sharing a highlight reel while barely holding himself together. Honestly, that is the most human thing in the whole story. And then there is the moment that changes everything. That night in November 2020. His wife finds him after the attempt, and that is the point of no return. That is the kind of sentence that drops the temperature in a room. Because once someone you love sees you at that edge, the secrecy is gone. And he is not just ashamed of the attempt, he is ashamed of being witnessed in it. Which is such a painful thing because shame multiplies the injury. He keeps coming back to the idea that he was supposed to be the strong one. That expectation is poison when you are already drowning. Also, who decided husbands are supposed to be granite statues? Civilization has been running on that lie for way too long. But the wife piece is crucial because she does not shame him. She gets help. That is the whole difference between surviving and losing somebody. Sometimes love looks like calling the doctor while your hands are shaking. And he says that was the first time he felt unconditional love from outside family. That line landed hard for me because it says a lot about what he never had. Yeah, when your whole life is built around proving yourself, receiving care can feel unfamiliar. Or even undeserved, which is the cruelest part. I also think the therapy piece matters more than people realize. This was not a single dramatic rescue. It was someone forcing structure back into chaos. Therapy gave language to what had been swallowing him. And language is huge, because once you can name the thing, it stops being a monster in the dark. Not smaller, just less shapeless. Exactly, and that is maybe the first real rebuild in this story. Not magic yet, not fame, just naming the wreckage honestly. And that is where I think the power is, weirdly enough. Not in the comeback video, but in the admission that he needed help to stay alive. That is the part people should actually sit with. Because the next chapter is not about being untouchable. It is about trying to become a person who can survive being touched by life. And honestly, that is way more interesting than perfection. Way more interesting and way more honest. All right, let us leave it there for this chapter. We will pick this up in episode 3, where the rebuild starts looking real. And where the question becomes not what broke him, but what he does next. That is where it gets good. Welcome back, because this one gets heavy fast and weirdly human. It is about success, identity, illness, and the moment the mask starts fighting the man. And honestly, that is where the whole story gets dangerous in a real way. Dangerous and fascinating, which is basically every great collapse. He is talking about the point where Dynamo stopped feeling like a career and started feeling like a trap. That is such a brutal sentence to live inside. Especially when the thing you are trapped by is the thing that made you matter. That is the sick joke, right? The world applauds the brand while the person quietly falls apart. Yeah, and then everyone says, but you were so successful. Success does not cancel pain. It sometimes just hides it better. And in his case, the body started breaking before the mind had a chance to catch up. Crohn's, food poisoning, surgeries, arthritis, all of that sounds like a horror movie. And the maddest part is he had to keep waiting months to find out treatments were failing. That waiting is its own kind of violence. Because you are not just sick, you are suspended. And if your whole identity depends on physical control, that is devastating. A magician who cannot hold cards is like a drummer with no hands. Slightly limiting, yes. Slightly is doing Olympic-level work there. But that is the piece people miss when they talk about identity loss. They think it is about ego when it is actually about function. If the thing you use to make meaning disappears, the floor really does vanish. And then there is the family part, which honestly hit me harder. His grandfather seeing the work on television, that is beautiful. Like he got to see the magic become real. That is the kind of win that does not need a trophy. And then his grandmother, who supported him but also feared the dream would fail. That is so real, though. The people who love you most are often the ones begging you to keep a backup plan, which is just family code for, please do not make me panic every year. Exactly, and then the dream works anyway, which is rude. But even when it works, loss still keeps collecting its debt. The grandmother passing, the legal fight, the body failing, that is too much at once. Too much for anybody, not just for a celebrity with a cape on. And I think that is where the identity split becomes unbearable. Steven is the human being, Dynamo is the impossible one. When Steven cannot function and Dynamo cannot perform, where do you stand? In a very bad room in your own head, apparently. With no good lighting. Terrible lighting, terrible playlist, terrible everything. But that image of noise in the head was such a good explanation. Because it is not just sadness, it is interference. You cannot create if the room inside you is screaming. And then people on the outside just see silence and think laziness or distance. Which is cruel because silence is often survival. His wife becoming the person who notices, intervenes, and holds the line matters a lot. That is not a small thing, that is a life-saving thing. And you could hear him realizing that he had been loved through the worst of it. Not admired, loved. Those are different currencies. Very different exchange rates, too. One is applause, one is somebody finding you in the dog bed. That detail just lands like a brick. Because it is the exact moment fantasy ends and reality starts doing CPR. And what really got me is his shame about being seen like that. Not shame that he hurt, shame that someone he loved had to witness it. That is such a masculine kind of pain, honestly. The idea that you are supposed to be the protector even while you are drowning. A very efficient system for making people worse. The patriarchy, everybody, still terrible. But the interesting pushback here is he does not actually sound ashamed of needing help. He sounds ashamed that the collapse became visible. That is a massive distinction. Visibility can feel like humiliation when you are already fragile. And then there is the management dispute, which is complicated without needing gossip. He basically had to step away, go quiet, and rebuild while legal stuff sat in the background. Which is horrible if your whole medium depends on momentum and public presence. Social media is not just posting, it is part of the machine now. If you lose access to the machine, you lose a lot of oxygen. And if you are already mentally underwater, that is not a pause, that is sinking slower. He said he did not feel like his life was worth sharing, and that is heartbreaking. Because it shows how far gone a person can get from their own value. Not because the value is gone, but because access to it is gone. Damn, that is a cleaner way to say it than most therapists would. Therapists are probably furious right now. Still, the thing he keeps returning to is magic as purpose. Not fame, not the name, not the awards, just the act itself. That feels like the whole point of the episode. When the stage name becomes a cage, the only way out is remembering who made the miracle first. All right, that is a wrap for this chapter, and we needed every bit of it. Episode 3 is where the rebuild starts feeling earned, not imagined. We will pick it up there because that is where the real forward motion begins. And that is where it gets even more interesting.